wisdom,
prudentia,
justice,
justitia,
temperance,
temperantia,
courage.
fortitudo.
Applying ancient philosophy to modern life, this is the Sunday Stoic.
Good day, and welcome to the Sunday Stoic podcast. I am Dan Monks of Queens, New York City. Steve has graciously agreed to let me do a solo episode today. Many of us came to Stoicism to learn how to mitigate negative emotions. In Stoicism, passions are emotions turbulent and severe enough to cloud or narrow our perceptions. When in the grip of a passion, the person's rational faculty is no longer in charge of their behavior. Instead, we are carried along by our emotions, behaving unreflectively. This leads to all sorts of inappropriate and harmful actions. Passions have been called a temporary madness, and I think that is an apt description. Since unreflective actions when in the grip of a passion can corrupt our character, passions should be avoided at all costs. Some of the passions include anger, envy, fear, grief, and lust. Stoicism is a lived philosophy wherein we demonstrate our progress toward virtue by fulfilling our social roles through appropriate actions. Uncontrolled and unreflective actions when we are in the grip of a passion make it impossible to act appropriately and would likely even lead to actions that would be harmful to our character. Consequently, it's important to have a strategy to avoid falling into the grip of a passion. Today, I'm going to talk about what is often termed proto-passions or first movements. Proto-passions are the warning bell that signals that a passion is forming. When we perceive something that at first appears to us to be extremely negative, it will trigger a proto-passion. There is a brief moment where we have the capability of either assenting to or rejecting the value judgment that is precipitating the passion. The key is to notice the beginning of the emotional turbulence and take a moment and apply what moderns term the dichotomy of control, which is best expressed in the Handbook of Epictetus, Section 1. If anything disturbing you is something outside of your own mind or actions, reject the value judgment that something bad is happening. The only evil is moral corruption, and what is disturbing you is an external. It cannot corrupt your character. What counts is how you react to adverse conditions. The best breakdown I've encountered regarding proto-passions is found in Book 19.1 of Attic Nights by Aulus Gellius. Before I start the reading, it may be important to know a few things about the author and his book. Aulus Gellius was a 2nd century Roman intellectual, and he was alive during the reign of 3 emperors, including Marcus Aurelius. The surviving work we have by Aulus Gellius is called Attic Nights, Attic being a reference to the fact that he started the book while he was studying in Athens. Attic Nights is a journal of sorts, wherein Aulus Gellius wrote down whatever he thought was most important from his studies at the time. His primary topics were philosophy, history, and grammar. Nothing I've read indicates that he considered himself to be a Stoic, but he held them in high regard, as you will hear from the reading. It should be noted that originally, the discourses of Epictetus were composed of 8 books. Today, only 4 books of the discourses survive. One thing that makes this section of Attic Nights so special is that he is quoting from the lost Book 5 of the discourses. Book 19.1 of Attic Nights is a few pages long, so I have edited it down for brevity. As always on the Sunday Stoic podcast, today's reading comes from a public domain version. Attic Nights, Book 19.1. The reply of a certain philosopher when he was asked why he turned pale in a storm at sea. We were sailing from Cassiopa to Brundisium over the Ionian Sea, violent, vast, and storm-tossed. During almost the whole of the night which followed our first day, a fierce side wind blew, which had filled our ship with water. Then, afterwards, While we were all still lamenting and working hard at the pumps, day at last dawned, but there was no less danger and no slackening of the violence of the wind. In our company was an eminent philosopher of the Stoic sect, whom I had known at Athens as a man of no slight importance. In the midst of the great dangers of that time and that tumult of sea and sky, I looked for him, desiring to know in what state of mind he was, and whether he was unterrified and courageous. And then I beheld the man, frightened and ghastly pale, not indeed uttering any lamentations, as all the rest were doing, nor any outcries of that kind, but in his loss of color and distracted expression, not differing much from the others. When the sky cleared, the sea grew calm, and the heat of danger cooled, I asked him what the reason for his fear was, and he quietly and courteously replied, "Since you are desirous of knowing, hear what our forefathers, the founders of the Stoic sect, thought about that brief but inevitable and natural fear. Or rather," said he, "read it, for if you read it, you'll be the more ready to believe it, and you'll remember it better." Thereupon, before my eyes, he drew from his little bag the 5th book of the discourses of the philosopher Epictetus, which, as arranged by Arrian, undoubtedly agree with the writings of Zeno and Chrysippus. In that book I read this statement, which of course was written in Greek: "The mental visions, which the philosophers call phantasia or fantasies, by which the mind of man on the very first appearance of an object is impelled to the perception of the object, are neither voluntary nor controlled by the will, but through a certain power of their own they force their recognition upon men. But the expressions of assent, by which these visions are recognized, are voluntary and subject to man's will. Therefore, when some terrifying sound, either from heaven or from a falling building, or as a sudden announcement of some danger, or anything else of that kind occurs, even the mind of a wise man must necessarily be disturbed, must shrink and feel alarm, not from a preconceived idea of any danger, but from certain and swift unexpected attacks which forestall the power of the mind in reason. Presently, however, the wise man does not approve such fantasies. That is to say, he does not consent to such terrifying mental visions, nor confirm them, but he rejects and scorns them, nor does he see in them anything that ought to excite fear. And they say that there is this difference between the mind of a foolish man and that of a wise man, that the foolish man thinks that such visions are, in fact, as dreadful and terrifying as they appear at the original impact of them on his mind, and by his assent he approves of such ideas as if they were rightly to be feared, and confirms them. But the wise man, after being affected for a short time, and slightly in his color and expression, does not assent, but retains the steadfastness and strength of the opinion which he has always had about visions of this kind, namely, that they are in no way to be feared, but excite terror by a false appearance and vain alarms. That these were the opinions and utterances of Epictetus the philosopher, in accordance with the beliefs of the Stoics, I read in that book which I have mentioned, and I thought that they ought to be recorded for this reason, that when things of the kind which I have named chance to occur, we may not think that to fear for a time, and as it were turn white, is the mark of a foolish and weak man, but in that brief but natural impulse we yield rather to human weakness than because we believe that those things are what they seem." Aulus Gellius, Attic Nights, 19.1. The advice of Epictetus applies to all proto-passions, but it so happens that I have a personal example that falls almost perfectly within the example set by Epictetus via Aulus Gellius. One day in the teens of the 21st century, I was on my morning walk in my neighborhood here in Queens. I saw workers loading trash into their garbage truck. The noise was distracting me from the tranquility of my morning walk, so I turned the corner as quickly as I could to reduce the noise of the garbage truck. A moment later, I heard the loud boom of an explosion. It was close and loud enough to affect my inner ear. I froze for a second and took mental inventory of my body and confirmed that I was still in working order. After that, I had to consider the source of the boom. Being New York City, I had to consider the possibility of terrorism, but I quickly disposed of that as unlikely. Terrorists would not strike a residential street at 5:30 a.m. They would wait for rush hour. I then contemplated what I should do. One option was just to move as quickly as possible away from the noise. I decided that would not be the correct thing to do. If someone were injured, I could render aid until an ambulance arrived due to my combat lifesaver training I received in the Army. So I leaned my head back around the corner, just enough to see what was going on in the street that I had just been walking. I saw the garbage truck with smoke pluming from the compactor, and 2 sanitation workers running to put out the fire, one of which had a fire extinguisher in their hands. Relieved that nobody appeared to be injured, I went about my morning business. The proto-passion that something terrible had happened was incorrect, and on that day I could be proud of the fact that I had not fled, but was instead prepared to provide help to any potential injured people. On that particular morning, I had made a proper use of impressions. So, when you notice the disturbance of a proto-passion, do not think all is lost. You're in good company. Even the Stoic sage would be subject to proto-passions. The key is to withhold assent to the impression and examine your value judgments. If the disturbance relates to anything outside your mind or your actions, deny the value judgment that something bad is transpiring, and thus block the development of a full-blown passion. If you do this, you'll be able to more readily perform appropriate acts with courage and justice and be of use to your fellow humans. For those who want to find out more about the author of today's reading, his name is Aulus Gellius, which is spelled Aulus. And for those who want to do an in-depth study of Stoicism as it relates to emotions, I highly recommend the book Stoicism and Emotion by Margaret Graver. Thank you for listening to the Sunday Stoic podcast, and I look forward to speaking with you next Sunday, Fortuna permitting.